To build an API inside your Next.js project, you can create files inside the pages/API folder. Each file inside that folder will be treated as an API endpoint by Next.js instead of a client-side page. The mapping works the same way as with client-side routing. It is based on the file system and the folder structure. So let's start by creating a post folder and an index.js file inside it, which will be the API endpoints for working with the blog posts. For an API route to work, you need to export a function as default, which is actually the request handler that receives a request and a response parameters. Inside that function, use rec.method to process a GET request to the /API/post API endpoint. Then use your Fauna query manager to retrieve all blog posts from the database by passing the author, the page size, and the after cursor that you can retrieve from the query string using rec.query. Before moving on with our API endpoint, we need to update our query manager, as so far we have not built it to filter the blog post by author. So open the fauna.js file, and inside the getPost method, use object destructuring to retrieve the author from the option arguments, and all the other options as a separate object. Replace the option parameter from the paginate function with the new option object that does not contain the author property. Then, inside the join function, check if we have an author. If yes, use the post search by publish author index, pass through for the publish property and the author as well. Otherwise, use the post search by published index as before. So, if an author has been specified, we use the index that search for all the published posts from that author. Otherwise, we use the index that return all the published blog posts from all the authors. Now, let's use the same logic with the getDraft method. Check for the author and use the corresponding index, but this time by passing false for the published property, as we want to retrieve the draft only. Now that we have the logic in place, we need to create the new indexes for searching the blog post by author. So go back to your FaunaDB dashboard and open the shell. Use the createIndex method to create the post search by publish author index. Specify the source as the blog post collection, and then add the terms. First, we need the publish property from the data, and then we need the email property from the author inside the data. Finally, run the query and make sure your index has been created properly above. Alright, now let's go back to our editor. In our API endpoint, we are passing the after cursor to the getPost method. However, as this cursor is passed through the query string, and therefore it is stringified, we can't use it as is inside our FaunaDB queries. It needs to be a valid FaunaDB expression and not a string. So let's build a method inside our query manager to convert a FaunaDB cursor from a string back to a valid Fauna expression. Let's call this method toExpr and pass our string to it. Next, create and return a new expression instance from our string after parsing it. This expr class is not documented by FaunaDB, but it is actually available inside the FaunaDB JavaScript driver, which is very useful and saves us a lot of time as we don't have to implement the logic ourselves to convert a string back to a valid Fauna expression. So don't forget to import it at the top. Now let's go back to our API endpoint and use that method to convert our cursor before passing it to the getPost method. Next, use the res parameter to send the 200 status code and the blog posts retrieved from the FaunaDB query as a JSON object. Finally, in case something goes wrong, log the error and send a 500 status code with the error message. Alright, let's keep going with our API endpoints and handle the post request to /API/post to create a new post. Check that the request method is post and use the createPost method from the query manager by passing the data from rec.body. Then send a 200 status code with the newly created blog posts. Now let's create the API endpoints to handle individual blog posts. For that, we'll use dynamic API routes by creating a new file named id wrap inside square brackets .js. As you can see, this is following the same naming rules as with the client-side pages. As before, create a new handler function that we will use to handle requests to /API/post/ID. The first API endpoint we will create is the one to retrieve a single blog post by its ID. So start by checking the request method, and then use the getPost method from our Fauna query manager by passing the blog post ID to it. Once the blog post has been retrieved from the database, send it to the client with a 200 status code. Now, for updating a blog post, check that the request method is patched. Use the updatePost method and pass the blog post ID along with the body object of the request, which contains the new data for that post. Then, send the updated blog post back to the client. Next, implement the API endpoint for deleting a blog post by checking that the request method is delete, and use the corresponding method from the query manager with the blog post ID, and send back the deleted blog post to the client. Don't forget to get the blog post ID from the request query object at the top. Finally, if you receive a request with a method that we have not implemented above, send a 400 status code with an error message. Do the same thing with the previous API endpoints inside the index.js file. Alright, now let's handle the request for publishing a blog post. Create a new folder named Publish inside the post folder, and a new file named ID wrap around square brackets.js inside it. As before, create an handle function, retrieve the blog post ID from the request.query, and use the publish method from the Fauna query manager by passing the blog post ID and the new data from the request body. Finally, send the published blog post to the client using a 200 status code. As you may have noticed, this time we have not specified any request method. In this case, all the requests to the /API/post/publish/ID route, including GET request but not only, will be handled and publish the blog post from the request query. You can go ahead and restrict the request method for this API endpoint if you like, as we did with the previous API endpoint. But here, to save some time, I won't do it so that we can move on to our last API endpoint for retrieving unpublished blog posts. So, create a new folder named draft and an index.js file inside it. This API endpoint is very similar to the one for the published blog post. So copy what we have done before and replace the getPost method by the getDraft method.